Noreena Hertz, thank you for joining us at Habits by Republica. It's an honor to have you here. I'll start directly.
Thank you for inviting me. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll start directly with my questions. Your last book, The Lonely Century, translated in Romanian Secolul Singurății, it's a beautiful journey and an invitation to reflect on how we became so lonely in this century. I would like to ask you, what is loneliness? What's your definition on loneliness?
That's a great question. Actually, it's surprising how few people ask me that question. So for me, loneliness is, of course, a feeling that many of us can recognize of craving connection and craving intimacy, feeling disconnected from our friends and family and neighbor. That is definitely loneliness and craving that connection. But I define loneliness as something else as well. There's also a sense of feeling disconnected from our fellow citizens, from our employer, from our workplace, from our politicians, an almost existential state of isolation, which bleeds into all areas of our lives, personal, economic, and political.
So as you said, loneliness is often seen as a personal experience, but as your book highlights, and as you mentioned previously, it's a broader societal, it has a broader societal implication. In which way loneliness impacts communities and society as a whole?
Well, it was actually my research on the rise of right-wing populism across the world, of politicians like Donald Trump in America, Matteo Salvini in Italy, or Alternative for Deutschland in Germany, who I just read today are polling incredibly highly, at around 20% in the German polls at the moment, or Le Pen in France. So I was trying to understand why people are voting for these kinds of politicians. And what came across very strongly and very surprisingly, as I started interviewing people who were voting for those politicians all over the world, was this common story that they shared with me, that they had felt very lonely and very isolated until they had found community and belonging in these parties of the far right. And empirical evidence backs this up. So we know, for example, that people who voted for Donald Trump when he was running against Hillary Clinton were more likely to have no friends than people who were voting for Hillary Clinton. We've seen it in other countries as well, this correlation between personal feelings of isolation, not having friends, and choosing to vote, particularly for parties of the extreme right, partly because perhaps they've done better than other parties at delivering a theatre of community. So if you remember the Donald Trump rallies where everyone would be wearing the same hats and chanting the same songs, I think they've been more effective at weaponizing community, preying upon the lonely, done it quite cynically, but also because when we're lonely, we tend to see the world as a more hostile, threatening place. We know this from a lot of research. And of course, this isn't everyone who's lonely I'm talking about. Let me just be very clear. So it's not that everyone who's lonely is voting for right extremist parties, nor that everyone who's lonely sees the world as a more hostile, threatening place, but we tend to, we are more likely to. And that's, of course, something that these politicians play upon, really exploiting kind of divisions amongst us and casting a world in which a world very much of us and them, so playing on fears of them. So I think it's for those two reasons that they are delivering a theatre of community, and they are playing to this fear, increased fearfulness about other people that lonely people have, which is making them so successful, one might think, amongst the lonely And I think it's important to just maybe land quite early on in our conversation just how big this problem is, because, you know, it may be that Romanian viewers aren't aware of the scale of the problem. But, you know, to give some global data, in the United States, 1 in 5 millennials doesn't have...
Rising, and it's very dangerous, the phenomenon.
Yes, and very widespread. I think that's important to land. So in the United States, 1 in 5 millennials doesn't have a single friend. In the United Kingdom, 2 in 5 under 25s are lonely always or often. In Romania, about a third of the population feel lonely at least some of the time. You know, Romania in Europe is one of the loneliest countries. So, you know, this is a big problem with a lot of people feeling lonely, with political implications and also with economic implications.
Yeah. We see this phenomenon rising also in Romania, and we see its threat. But this rhetoric of populism and nationalism addresses basically genuine needs. People have genuine needs, and they address these needs. But what can we do? How can we address this threat? As over the history, we saw the effect of this rhetoric. So what can we do?
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. Or at least they speak to those needs, which is a bit different to addressing those needs, because whether they deliver on those needs, I think is, well, so far we're not seeing delivery on the needs, but we're definitely seeing a speaking to the needs and a recognition, or at least an espoused recognition, that they hear, they see people who feel actually that mainstream politicians have not heard them and not seen them, often with legitimate cause in that regard. So, you know, I think traditional parties and parties of the centre need to acknowledge that there is actually a very significant constituency out there who feel disconnected from traditional politics, who feel that they've been unheard, who feel that they are invisible, who feel that they're unseen. Often this is linked with economic circumstance, but not always, and not necessarily. And it's important to really, firstly, acknowledge that people are struggling, the pain that they have and the struggles that they have. And secondly, actually do something about it, because of course, politics is about priorities. Politics is about kind of responding to certain groups more than others. And, you know, these people, the lonely, you know, are a group who often haven't been explicitly targeted or reached out to by politicians. And I think centrist politicians are missing a trick here, and actually would see in this group a willing constituency if they were to both truly acknowledge their kind of pain and struggle, truly see them, and understand the extent to which they want to feel they belong and feel that they currently don't.
Well, we're facing quite difficult times with all these things. It is known that loneliness overwhelms us with fears, and when we fear much, we are weaker. And I personally think that when you are in fear, you are easy target to manipulation. So do you think that there are governments or big companies using this fear? I mean, is it useful for someone who's keeping us in this lonely, spreading this lonely virus?
Yes, of course. I mean, this is what historically right populist and left populist parties have done. You know, they've exploited fear. Absolutely, absolutely. So whether it's immigrants or women or whatever, whoever is under attack, or the mentally ill, or whoever is being attacked, this is a well-known trope of populist politicians. Absolutely, to create division in society and exploit people's fears, and that's why we need to push back against it really firmly as a society. really firmly.
Why loneliness, Noreena? Why loneliness? What made you look at this difficult topic? Was there a particular event that sparked your interest in the subject?
So it was really three different events and circumstances. The first was my students. I was teaching at university, and about 5-6 years ago, I realized that more and more students were coming to my office and confiding in me that they felt lonely. And this wasn't something I'd seen like 10 years ago. It was something new. And the scale of it was really very shocking. And, I had thought about loneliness, but really mainly in the context of elderly people before. I had no idea that there was a loneliness crisis amongst the young. And in fact, it turns out that the young are the loneliest generation. So that was one reason. The other was my research, as we've already discussed, into the rise of right-wing populism. I wanted to understand what was driving these voters, interviewing them, researching them, looking at the academic data. I realized that loneliness was a real driver for how they were voting. So loneliness in another very different environment coming into my radar. And then I had bought an Amazon Alexa. I don't know, are they popular in Romania as well? Alexa? No, it's like a device.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah,
Alexa. And so I had bought an Alexa, this AI kind of object that lives in my kitchen. And I realized that I was becoming increasingly attached to my Alexa, my AI, which got me thinking about what I came to define as the loneliness economy. So an entire economy made up of goods and services designed to deliver connection and community, which was a growing sector. So I thought the market is recognizing that there's a lot of lonely people there. Loneliness is affecting how people vote. And my students, like the youngest generation, are feeling lonely. I thought I really want to dig into this subject and understand what's going on. How did we get here? Why does it matter? And importantly, what can we do about it? And that's what my book is about.
Yeah, I know, I read it, and I would advise our viewers and readers to read it. It's an excellent book, and I think that everybody should read it, especially nowadays. So, Secolul Singurății, please read it. Because you mentioned youngsters, and I would like to ask you something about education, because we live in a society where we teach our kids competition and that only the best matters. Those who are not performing in this imposed structure are left aside. They feel unworthy, losers, and ultimately lonely. I think that we should all sing out loudly Pink Floyd songs, another brick in the wall, leave the kids alone. But instead, we all obey and expose our children, kids, to this type of education, pushing them to perform. And I think that this kind of competition at some point make kids lonely, and they cannot really make friendships because of this. What can we do about it? What kind of education would you see useful?
So I think you're right. And I think this speaks to a kind of broader point in society at large, that really over the past 30 years, say, we've increasingly moved towards globally what I call the neoliberal mindset. So increasingly as a society, we've come to see ourselves as competitors rather than collaborators, as takers rather than givers, as hoarders rather than sharers. And as a society, we've valued and lionized and valorized these qualities at our collective expense. So I think you're absolutely right. Children are suffering, but society as a whole, I think, is suffering as well. And, just to be clear, because in former communist countries, it's important to be clear on these points. I am not romanticizing in any shape or form the kind of communist era when I make these comments. Believe me, I started my own career in Russia in the early 90s. I've had first-hand experience of a system that doesn't work at all. But I think, and again, this is a problem that the whole world kind of is on, is that we just went too far down that path of self-interest, competition, etc., without kind of acknowledging that it could come at a cost. What can we do when it comes to children? Well, I think, it's partly about kind of how we redefine success for children, but it's also about, we haven't spoken about these yet. Oh, I was just going to pick up my mobile phone and bring it to the camera, but it's just fallen on the floor. We haven't talked about mobile phones yet. And when we speak about
it's my second question.
Because when we speak about loneliness amongst young people, really, my research is, I'm really clear now, having dug into the research at great depth and length, that mobile phones, social media in particular, is in many ways the tobacco industry of the 21st century and really needs to be regulated at once. The harm it is doing to young people really cannot be overemphasized. I mean, Peter, this 14-year-old boy who told me what it was like when he would post on Instagram and then be hoping for somebody to like one of his posts, and when they didn't, he would feel so alone. Or Claudia, the 16-year-old girl who told me that her friends had said that they weren't going out after school, and then she was on her social media and she saw that they were going out and hadn't invited her, and she felt so excluded. I mean, it wasn't, of course, in the past, kids also could have been excluded, but today the shame of their exclusion is broadcast amongst their peer groups. And also the adults in their lives often don't even know the exclusion is going on, because so much of their socializing has migrated to their phones that you wouldn't know if somebody was not on a WhatsApp group or not part of a chat if you were the adult. So it's really disturbing. And actually, the United Kingdom is, in this regard, leading the way when it comes to new regulations and legislation aimed to rein social media companies in. Because the reality is that we are addicted to these platforms. They design them intentionally so that they're addictive. Every color that they choose, every flashing light, the way that they pass their algorithms, all designed to addict us and reward us for toxicity and hate and anger. And we as individuals, we can try, and I do try to restrict my social media usage and my phone usage, actually, and spend one day a week, take a digital Sabbath where I'm not on my phone at all. And I try in the evenings to move my phone so it's not in reach. But the reality is that there is a limit to what us individuals can do, and governments really have to step in here, especially when it comes to the young.
We should all do what you do with your phone and with your social media. It is mandatory. We also at Habits by Republica think that it's mandatory that we should decrease our usage of mobile phone and social media. So this is also our mission to try to explain the negativity that it brings to our life. Loneliness is painful to the extent that it hurts not only the soul but also the bodies. In the first pages of your book, you tell a personal story about yourself being young in school, in probably the first years of school. And that because you felt so lonely at that time, you had physical manifestation. Can you tell us, not that I want to disclose too much about your book, but just for the flavor, to tell us a bit about the story and what are the health consequences of loneliness?
Yes, so when I was about 7 years old, I had a really horrible year at school where one girl was kind of ruling the roost and I was really very excluded. And I remember this year profoundly because it was the year when I was repeatedly sick, repeated sore throats, repeated colds, repeated fevers. And it was only when researching this book that I realized, that I learned that loneliness doesn't only affect our mental state, and it does. If you're lonely, you're more likely to feel anxious or depressed, but loneliness also profoundly impacts our physical health. In fact, researchers have found that loneliness is as bad and damaging to our physical health as smoking 15 cigarettes a day.
Oh, wow.
It's incredible that there is this public health problem of the scale of smoking 15 cigarettes a day that is affecting, in Romania, almost a third of the population and isn't on politicians' radars. And why loneliness affects our health, because it isn't maybe obvious why it affects our health, is basically because we were never designed to be alone as humans. If you think back to our kind of evolutionary past, when we're like cave people, we were always with people. We were hunting with people. We were in tribes with people. It was what we needed to do. To survive. Exactly. And what that means is that when we feel lonely, we have a physiological reaction, which is so strong to kind of tell us, don't be in this state. So when we're lonely, our blood pressure goes up, our heart rate goes up, our levels of cholesterol go up, our ability to fight infection goes down. All of these signaling to our body, don't be alone, don't be alone. The trouble is that in contemporary life, we remain lonely for protracted periods, which is why the health effects are so serious. Loneliness increases significantly our risk of heart attack, our risk of stroke, our risk of dementia, and reduces our life expectancy.
It's incredible that loneliness has so many effects on individuals, on societies, and also on economies, and yet governments are doing nothing, at least in Romania. Looking ahead, what do you envision for the future of human connection and loneliness?
Well, I'm optimistic on a number of fronts. Firstly, I'm optimistic that business is stepping in for two reasons. First of all, lonely workers are less productive, less motivated, and more likely to quit than workers who are not. So there's a business case for companies to invest in making their workers feel less lonely and their workplace more of a community. And it's a challenge because globally 40% of office workers currently feel lonely, but businesses are recognizing that they're paying an economic price for this, and they're doing things. And one of the most simple things that makes a big impact is actually encouraging your staff to eat together. When people eat together, they feel considerably more bonded and actually perform, it turns out, twice as well. So I feel optimistic because business recognizes there's a problem in that way and is starting to do something. And I can see from, I'm approached by so many CEOs of big companies since my book came out who want my help in how they can help their staff reconnect. So that's encouraging. The other reason why I'm encouraged about the role business is playing is because the other thing I'm seeing, having written this best-selling book, is so many companies approach me who have business ideas in this space. So, are coming up with ideas for how do you help people connect in the real world as well as virtually. One of the examples I love that I talk about in my book are these daytime discotheques in South Korea called kolateques, where thousands of elderly people dance during the day, every single day. I mean, a great business makes great profit and is alleviating loneliness. So, I think the loneliness economy is only going to grow over the coming years. That's reason for optimism. The other reason I'm optimistic is that governments across the world are starting to take this issue really seriously, in particular the United Kingdom, Japan, and the United States, who all now have very publicly decided to address and try to alleviate loneliness in a meaningful way. When it comes to social media regulation, again, we are seeing movement on this front, not only in the UK, but at the European Union level and in America, where it's an issue which actually has bipartisan support, so support from Republicans and Democrats. So that makes me optimistic. And then the other reason I'm optimistic is that, thanks to books like mine, in part, and thanks to the work I'm sure that you are doing yourself as well, with your platform, we're starting to talk about loneliness more than we ever were. We're starting to talk about this problem. And that's great because it means that we as individuals have more that we can do and are starting to do more. And there is so much that we as individuals can do if we want to help alleviate loneliness. Some of it is really small. I mean, just if we think about our own loneliness, even just a 30-second chat with a barista in a cafe makes a huge difference to how lonely we feel. But if we're thinking about helping others and trying to help loneliness at large, a few things I think we can very easily do. One, really actively support our local shops and our local communities. I don't know if it's the same in Romania, but here in the UK, accelerated by the pandemic, a lot of us have migrated a lot of our activities online. So, maybe we used to go to a cafe, but now we might order some food on our app. Is it the same? Or we might have gone to a yoga class, but now we might do it on Zoom. These face-to-face interactions are irreplaceable. They make a huge difference face-to-face to how connected or lonely we feel. And more than that, actually, those are the moments in our day when we have these face-to-face interactions that we practice the skills that underpin inclusive democracy, reciprocity, kindness, thinking about others and not only themselves. So we have to commit to that. And I think we can. And also, I'm optimistic because as we have these conversations, I think what it's doing, and then so many people are telling me that having read the book, they're actually changing how they're living in certain ways. One of the things I think we're all doing as a result is thinking more about who in our own network might be feeling lonely and actively reaching out to them, maybe arranging to meet them for a coffee, maybe even, picking up the phone, maybe even sending them just a message, but showing people that we are thinking about them, that we care, can make a huge difference. And, I'm so encouraged to hear so many wonderful stories from my readers of the initiatives that they are doing, inspired by the book and other people's work as well. So I feel optimistic. We are in the midst of a loneliness epidemic and crisis, but it's one that we have the power to address and fix.
We should act together. And there are so many beautiful examples in your book. And I will take the opportunity to say that we are doing walks with people, with strangers in a park each week, just to do a community and to increase the connection between people. It was a real pleasure talking to you. Thank you for this beautiful conversation.
Such a pleasure as well. And maybe the next time I'm in Romania, I can be invited on one of the books.
Oh, it would be great to meet you in person, to have a real connection.
It would be great.
Thank you very much for this wonderful conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a nice day. Thank you.
Vă mulțumim că ne-ați urmărit, sperăm că v-a fost de folos și vă invităm în comunitatea noastră a Societății Omului Sănătos.